The thunderous hooves of a lone stallion echoed across the dusty plains of Wyoming Territory, as the last light of day painted the sky in shades of crimson and gold. Vapor Tanner rode with a straight back, his face weathered by years under the harsh western sun, eyes fixed on the horizon that seemed to stretch into infinity. The year was 1878, and for 3 seasons now, he had traversed the untamed wilderness that separated him from the only place he ever thought of as home, a modest ranch where Katherine Newsom waited faithfully at the wooden gate, scanning the distance for his silhouette. The vast emptiness of the frontier suited Vapor just fine. Words had never come easy to him, not since the war took his brother and left him with nothing but haunted memories and a silver star pinned to his chest. As a former sheriff turned cattle driver, he preferred the language of the land, the whisper of prairie grass, the mournful cry of distant coyotes, and the steady rhythm of his horse's gait. Some called him mute, others called him proud, but the truth was simpler. Vapor Tanner had seen too much of mankind's cruelty to trust in empty conversation. 50 miles still separated him from Katherine's gate, but he pushed on through the twilight. His cattle drive had been successful, 300 head, delivered to the railroad at Cheyenne for a handsome profit. Now, with saddlebags heavy with payment and a heart lighter with each mile closer to home, he allowed himself to think of her, the schoolteacher with eyes the color of summer sage, who had somehow found value in a man of so few words. Katherine Newsom stood at the gate as she did every evening, one hand shielding her eyes from the setting sun. At 26, she had long ago dismissed the notion that she would ever marry. The war had taken too many men, and frontier life demanded more than most could give. But then Vapor had arrived in Sweetwater Creek 3 years prior, taciturn and mysterious, and something about his quiet dignity had captured her attention in ways the verbose suitors of her past never could. "Miss Katherine, you're going to wear a trench in that spot," called Harriet Bishop, Katherine's elderly neighbor who had taken to checking on the younger woman during Vapor's extended absences. "He'll be back soon," Katherine replied, her voice carrying more certainty than she felt. "His last letter said the drive would end 3 weeks ago. He should be on his way home." Harriet clicked her tongue. "Men and their promises. My Herbert always claimed he'd be back before the bread cooled, then wouldn't return until the next day." "Vapor doesn't make promises lightly," Katherine said, turning from the gate with reluctance. "When he says he'll return, he does." Yet as she followed Harriet back to the small ranch house that had become her home, doubt crept in like the evening chill. 3 years of loving a man who spoke perhaps 100 words a month had taught her patience, but it had also taught her fear. The Western Territories were unforgiving bandits, disease, harsh weather, and wild animals claimed lives without warning or mercy. Inside the modest cabin, Katherine lit the lantern and moved to the small writing desk where she kept her journal. Each night since Vapor's departure 4 months ago, she had recorded her thoughts, her hopes, and her worries. The leather-bound book had become her confidant in his absence, the repository of words she would never speak aloud for fear of tempting fate. "I watched for him again today," she wrote, her penmanship precise from years of teaching. "The horizon remains empty, but my heart refuses to believe anything but his safe return. Tomorrow I will wait again." Miles away, Vapor made camp beneath a sprawling cottonwood tree, his fire small and controlled. After tending to his horse, a magnificent buckskin named Commander, he settled against his saddle and pulled a worn photograph from his breast pocket. Katherine's image, captured by a traveling photographer the previous spring, showed her seated primly in her best dress, but it was the slight curve of her lips, a smile she reserved only for him, that made the picture precious. Vapor ran a calloused thumb over the image, remembering the day he had first seen her. He had ridden into Sweetwater Creek tracking a gang of cattle rustlers, his badge glinting in the sunlight. Katherine had been outside the schoolhouse, reading to a circle of children. Something about the melodic cadence of her voice had made him rein in Commander and listen, transfixed by the simple beauty of her storytelling. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond his camp, and Vapor was instantly alert, his revolver drawn before the sound had faded. A moment passed in tense silence before a young buck deer emerged from the brush, regarded him with curious eyes, then bounded away. Vapor holstered his weapon and exhaled slowly. The west was changing, railroads stretching across the country, settlers arriving by the wagon load, towns springing up where once only wilderness stood. But danger still lurked in the spaces between civilization, and a man alone had to remain vigilant. As he settled back against his saddle, Vapor's thoughts returned to Katherine. Their courtship had been unconventional by any standard. For weeks after arriving in Sweetwater Creek, he had found reasons to pass by the schoolhouse, nodding respectfully but never speaking. Katherine had been the one to break the silence, approaching him one Sunday after church with a simple question about his horse. His response had been brief but sufficient to encourage further conversation. Over time, they had developed a rhythm. She would speak, filling the air with observations and questions, and he would reply with minimal but thoughtful words or sometimes just a gesture. Somehow, she understood what many others could not. Vapor's silence wasn't rejection, but rather a different language altogether. Their first kiss had come unexpectedly on a cool autumn evening. He had escorted her home from a town social, and at her gate, the same gate where she now waited, Katherine had stood on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his. The moment had changed everything, cementing a bond that needed no elaborate declarations. Vapor stared into the dying embers of his fire, calculating the remaining distance to Sweetwater Creek. If he rode hard, he could be there by sunset tomorrow. With that comforting thought, he pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders and closed his eyes, allowing sleep to claim him. The next morning dawned clear and bright, promising fair weather for travel. Vapor broke camp efficiently, his movements economical after years on the trail. As he mounted Commander, his eyes caught a glint of something metallic in the distance, riders, moving fast and purposefully across the plain. Instinct made him lead Commander into a dense copse of trees, where they could observe without being seen. 6 men approached, hard-looking and heavily armed. Vapor recognized their leader instantly, Jackson Reese, a notorious outlaw with a reputation for ruthlessness. Reese had once been Vapor's deputy in a small Texas town before turning to robbery and murder. The men passed within 100 yards of Vapor's position, heading in the direction of Sweetwater Creek. Cold dread settled in his stomach as he considered their possible intentions. The town had recently established a bank, and a successful cattle season meant money would be flowing. It was exactly the kind of target Reese preferred. Vapor waited until the riders were specks on the horizon before emerging from his hiding place. He would need to take a different route, one that would get him to Sweetwater Creek ahead of Reese and his gang. That meant pushing Commander harder than he would like and traversing rougher terrain, but the alternative was unthinkable. With a click of his tongue and a slight pressure of his knees, Vapor directed Commander toward a barely visible trail that led into the foothills. Katherine's safety and that of the town now depended on his ability to outpace danger. Back in Sweetwater Creek, Katherine rose with the sun, her routine unchanged despite the hollow ache of longing that had become her constant companion. After dressing, she prepared a simple breakfast and stepped onto the porch of the small ranch house. The property had been Vapor's before it became theirs, a modest spread with enough grazing land for the small herd he maintained between his longer drives. The morning air carried the promise of warmth, and Katherine took a moment to appreciate the beauty of their land. Wildflowers dotted the meadow that stretched from the house to the creek that gave the town its name. In the corral, Vapor's spare horse, a gentle mare named Duchess, nickered in greeting. "Good morning to you two," Katherine called, her voice carrying across the stillness. After tending to the mare and the few chickens they kept, Katherine returned to the house to gather her teaching materials. Though Vapor's cattle business provided well for them, she had continued teaching at the town school, finding fulfillment in shaping young minds. As she prepared to leave, Katherine paused at the small mirror in the entryway, studying her reflection. At 26, she remained attractive, though perhaps not in the conventional way celebrated in Eastern society. Her chestnut hair was secured in a practical bun, her complexion tanned from outdoor work rather than sheltered to maintain fashionable paleness. But it was her eyes that Vapor had once described, in a rare moment of verbosity, as alive with something worth knowing. The memory brought a smile to her lips. Vapor might be frugal with words, but when he did speak, his observations carried the weight of careful consideration. Katherine collected her books and headed toward town, a 20-minute walk along a well-worn path. As she approached the main street, she noticed unusual activity around the bank, a newly constructed building that represented Sweetwater Creek's growing prosperity. "Morning, Miss Newsom," called Mr. Fitzgerald, the bank manager, as he supervised the unloading of a large safe from a freight wagon. "Good morning," Katherine replied. "That looks substantial." Fitzgerald beamed with pride. "Just arrived from Denver, the most secure model available. We're expecting a significant deposit from the railroad company tomorrow, payment for all the cattle shipped east this season." Katherine nodded politely, though something about the public nature of this announcement troubled her. Sweetwater Creek might be growing, but it was still a small town where news traveled fast. Such information about valuable shipments could easily reach the wrong ears. At the schoolhouse, Katherine found her students already gathered in the yard, enjoying the last few minutes before lessons began. 20 children ranging from 6 to 16 years of age comprised her class, a diverse group that included the offspring of ranchers, merchants, and the town's small but growing professional class. "Miss Newsom," young Emma Wilson called out, "is Mr. Tanner back yet?" Katherine smiled at the 10-year-old who had developed a particular admiration for Vapor after he had rescued her kitten from a tree the previous autumn. "Not yet, Emma, but soon, I hope." "Pa says Mr. Tanner don't talk 'cause he's hiding from the law," announced Billy Thompson, a freckle-faced boy with a penchant for stirring trouble. "Your father should mind his speculation," Katherine replied firmly. "And it's doesn't talk, not don't talk. Now, let's all go inside and begin our day with mathematics." As the children filed into the schoolhouse, Katherine found herself reflecting on Billy's comment. Such rumors had followed Vapor since his arrival in Sweetwater Creek. His reluctance to speak of his past, combined with his taciturn nature, had fueled speculation among the more gossip-inclined townsfolk. Some believed he was a former outlaw seeking redemption, others suspected he was running from a tragic past. Katherine knew pieces of the truth enough to understand that Vapor's silence was born of trauma rather than guilt. He had served honorably during the war, risen to the position of sheriff in a Texas border town, and left that life behind after a violent confrontation that had claimed his younger brother's life. The details remained shadowy, but Katherine had never pressed. She trusted that when Vapor was ready, he would share more. The school day progressed normally, with Katherine guiding her students through lessons in arithmetic, reading, and history. By mid-afternoon, however, she noticed several of the older boys casting anxious glances out the windows. "What has captured your attention, Thomas?" she finally asked one of her most diligent students. "There are strangers in town, Miss Newsom," the 14-year-old replied. "Rough-looking men, they've been at the saloon since noon." Katherine approached the window and looked toward the main street. Indeed, several unfamiliar horses were hitched outside the Sweetwater saloon. This in itself wasn't unusual travelers frequently passed through, but something about Thomas's concerned tone made her uneasy. "Well, let's not be distracted," she said, returning to the lesson. "The exploration of the Louisiana Territory is far more interesting than a few visitors to our town." When school dismissed at 4 o'clock, Katherine remained behind to grade papers and prepare the next day's lessons. By the time she left the schoolhouse, the sun was lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. As she walked toward home, she noticed the strangers Thomas had mentioned emerging from the saloon. 6 men, heavily armed and projecting an aura of menace that made Katherine instinctively cross to the opposite side of the street. "Evening, madam," called the tallest of the group, tipping his hat with exaggerated politeness. "Fine day in your lovely town." Katherine nodded curtly but didn't slow her pace. Something about the man's smile reminded her of a predator all teeth and no warmth. "Now don't rush off," the man continued, stepping into the street to intercept her. "Name's Jackson Reese. My associates and I are just passing through, looking for a bit of local hospitality." "You'll find the hotel at the end of the street," Katherine replied, attempting to step around him. Reese moved to block her path again. "Actually, we were hoping for a more personal welcome. Perhaps you could recommend a place for dinner, or better yet, join us." Katherine felt her heart quicken with apprehension. "I'm afraid I have prior commitments, if you'll excuse me." Before Reese could respond, Sheriff Dalton appeared at the corner, his weathered face set in stern lines. "Everything all right here, Miss Newsom?" "Just fine, Sheriff," Katherine answered, relief evident in her voice. "I was directing these gentlemen to the hotel." Reese's demeanor shifted subtly as he assessed the lawman. "Much obliged for your concern, Sheriff. We were just making acquaintance with this charming lady." Dalton, a former Army scout in his 50s, regarded the group with undisguised suspicion. "Sweetwater Creek is a peaceful town, gentlemen. We aim to keep it that way." "Wouldn't dream of disturbing the peace," Reese replied, his tone mockingly deferential. "We're just ordinary travelers with business in these parts." The sheriff nodded toward Katherine. "I'll walk you home, Miss Newsom." As they moved away from the strangers, Katherine could feel Reese's eyes following them. Once they were out of earshot, Sheriff Dalton spoke in a low voice. "Those men mean trouble. I recognize their leader from wanted posters, Jackson Reese, suspected of bank robberies in Colorado and Nebraska." "The bank just received a new safe," Katherine said, remembering Mr. Fitzgerald's proud announcement. "And there's a large payment expected tomorrow." Dalton's expression darkened. "That explains their presence. I've already sent a rider to the nearest Army outpost at Fort Laramie, but it will take at least 2 days for help to arrive." "What will you do?" Katherine asked, concern evident in her voice. "Organize the townsmen who can handle firearms, prepare for the worst while hoping these men move on." The sheriff hesitated, then added, "It might be best if you stayed in town tonight. Mrs. Dalton would be happy to have your company." Katherine shook her head firmly. "Thank you, but I'll be fine at the ranch. It's far enough from town that I doubt these men would bother riding out that way." The sheriff looked unconvinced but didn't argue. "At least take this," he said, pulling a small revolver from his coat pocket. "It was my wife's before her hands got too arthritic to handle it properly." Katherine accepted the weapon reluctantly. Though she had basic knowledge of firearms, a necessity in frontier life, she had never owned one herself. "Keep it close," Dalton advised as they reached the edge of town, "and bolt your doors tonight." "I will," Katherine promised, "and Sheriff, please be careful." As she continued alone along the path to the ranch, Katherine found her thoughts turning desperately to Vapor. His steady presence and quiet strength had never seemed more essential than now, with danger hovering at the edges of their community. Though she had always respected his need for solitude during his long rides, in this moment, she wished fervently that he had been more conventional, the kind of man who valued words enough to send frequent updates about his whereabouts. The ranch house came into view as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in spectacular hues of orange and purple. Katherine hurried her steps, suddenly eager for the security of familiar walls. As she approached the gate, the same gate where she faithfully watched for Vapor's return, a movement in the distant tree line caught her attention. Katherine froze, her hand moving to the pocket where she had placed Sheriff Dalton's revolver. For a breathless moment, she stared at the spot where she had seen the movement, wondering if her imagination was playing tricks on her. Then, emerging from the shadows of the pines, came a rider on a buckskin horse. Even at a distance, she would recognize that silhouette anywhere. Vapor rode with a distinctive straightness to his back, as though the years of hard living had forged his spine into steel rather than bending it. Relief flooded through her, so intense that her knees nearly buckled beneath her. Katherine ran to the gate, swinging it wide to allow Vapor's entrance. As he drew closer, she could see that both horse and rider bore the marks of hard travel dust coating their forms, weariness evident in the slight droop of Commander's head. Vapor reined in before her, his eyes scanning her face with an intensity that spoke volumes. Without dismounting, he extended a hand down to her. "Trouble," he said, the single word conveying urgency that Katherine immediately understood. "In town," she confirmed, grasping his hand. "6 men, their leader is Jackson Reese." A shadow crossed Vapor's features at the name recognition, and something darker that Katherine couldn't quite interpret. In one fluid motion, he pulled her up behind him on Commander's back. "Pack quickly," he instructed as they rode the short distance to the house. "Essentials only." Katherine didn't question his directive. In the 3 years they had been together, she had learned to trust Vapor's instincts implicitly. If he believed they needed to leave, then the danger was greater than she had realized. Once inside, Katherine moved efficiently, gathering clothes, food, and the small lockbox that contained their savings and important documents. She hesitated over her journal, then tucked it into the bundle as well. Throughout her hurried preparations, Vapor remained outside, vigilant as he surveyed the surrounding landscape with the practiced eye of a man accustomed to detecting threats. When she emerged 10 minutes later with a compact bundle, Vapor had already saddled Duchess and loaded his own provisions. He took Katherine's bundle and secured it to the mare's saddle, then helped her mount. "Where are we going?" Katherine asked as they rode away from the ranch house, heading not toward town but deeper into the surrounding wilderness. "Safe place," Vapor replied, guiding Commander alongside Duchess. "Old Trapper's cabin, 5 miles northeast." As they rode in the gathering darkness, Katherine pieced together the situation from Vapor's terse responses to her questions. He had encountered Reese's gang on the trail and recognized the threat they posed to Sweetwater Creek. Rather than confronting them directly, which would have been suicide against 6 armed men, he had chosen a different route home, hoping to warn the town before the outlaws could strike. "Sheriff Dalton knows who they are," Katherine informed him. "He's organizing the townsmen to defend the bank." Vapor shook his head grimly. "Not enough. Reese is smart, ruthless. You know him," Katherine observed. It wasn't a question. Vapor was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the rugged path ahead. Then, in more words than Katherine had heard from him in months, he shared a piece of his past. "He was my deputy in Pico's Springs. 8 years ago, good with a gun, bad with power, started taking bribes from cattle rustlers. When I confronted him, he denied everything. Next day, rustlers hit a ranch outside town. My brother Nathan was working there, tried to stop them. They shot him." Katherine absorbed this information, understanding dawning as Vapor continued, tracked the rustlers, found evidence linking them to Reese. "When I returned to arrest him, he was gone, left a note saying Nathan's death was a message, that I should have looked the other way." The pain in Vapor's voice was raw, despite the years that had passed. Katherine reached across the space between their horses and placed her hand on his arm, offering silent support. "Been hunting him since," Vapor concluded. "Reports placed him in Colorado, Nebraska. Never thought he'd come here." "He doesn't know you're in Sweetwater Creek?" Katherine asked. Vapor shook his head. "Changed my name after leaving Texas. Was Vernon Thomas then. Doubt he'd recognize me now." He ran a hand over his bearded face, which had indeed changed significantly from the clean-shaven lawman he had once been. They rode in silence for a time, each lost in thought as the horses picked their way through the increasingly difficult terrain. The moon had risen, providing enough light to navigate, but progress was slow on the rocky incline that led toward the mountains. Finally, after what seemed like hours, they reached a small clearing where a rudimentary cabin stood, partially concealed by towering pines. It was a simple structure, a single room with a stone chimney, built to withstand harsh weather rather than for comfort. "Found it last winter," Vapor explained as he helped Katherine dismount. "Tracked a mountain lion that was taking calves. Owner's been dead for years." Inside, the cabin was spare but sound. A rough-hewn table and chairs occupied one corner, a narrow bed frame another. The fireplace dominated the far wall, and shelves holding basic supplies lined the remaining space. It was dusty but dry, and Katherine felt a surge of gratitude for this hidden refuge. While Vapor tended to the horses, securing them in a small lean-to attached to the cabin, Katherine swept the floor and laid out their bedrolls. By the time Vapor returned, she had a small fire going in the fireplace, casting warm light across the rustic interior. They ate a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, supplemented with dried apples from Katherine's stores. Neither spoke much, the weight of the situation making conversation seem inadequate. It was only when they had finished eating that Katherine broached the subject they had both been avoiding. "What will happen to the town?" she asked, her voice quiet in the stillness of the cabin. Vapor's expression was grave. "Reese will rob the bank, anyone who resists." He didn't need to finish the sentence. "Then we have to go back," Katherine insisted. "We can't leave those people to face this alone." "Too dangerous," Vapor countered. "Sheriff has sent for help." "Help that won't arrive for at least 2 days," Katherine reminded him. "By then, it could be too late." Vapor rose from his chair and moved to the cabin's single window, staring out at the moonlit forest. His shoulders were tense, his posture rigid with the conflict raging within him. Katherine knew he was torn between his desire to protect her and his inherent sense of duty to the community that had accepted him. "I understand why you left that life behind," she said gently. "After what happened to Nathan, after chasing Reese for so long without finding justice. But you're still the same man who wore that badge, Vapor, the same man who believes in protecting the innocent." He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "Could lose everything," he said softly. "Could lose you." The vulnerability in his voice made Katherine's heart ache. She crossed the room to stand before him, taking his weathered hands in hers. "You won't lose me," she promised. "But we both might lose something of ourselves if we hide here while Sweetwater Creek suffers." For a long moment, Vapor said nothing, his eyes searching hers as though seeking certainty in an uncertain world. Then, with the barest nod, he reached a decision. "We'll need a plan," he said. "Can't fight them directly, too many, too well armed." Katherine smiled, relief and determination washing over her in equal measure. "Then we'll outsmart them." They spent the next few hours developing a strategy, drawing on Vapor's knowledge of Reese's tactics and Katherine's understanding of the town's layout. By the time exhaustion forced them to rest, they had formulated a plan that, while dangerous, offered their best chance of preventing disaster. As they settled onto their bedrolls, Vapor reached for Katherine's hand in the darkness. His grip was firm, grounding her in the present moment despite the fears that threatened to overwhelm her thoughts of tomorrow. "Katherine," he said, her name a rare sound on his lips. "If something happens, it won't," she interrupted, unwilling to entertain the possibility of failure. "If it does," he persisted, "know this, never had many words, but feeling, deep, for you, always." In the 3 years they had been together, it was perhaps the closest thing to a declaration of love that Vapor had ever expressed. Katherine felt tears prick at her eyes, understanding the magnitude of what he was trying to convey. "I know," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "I've always known." The next morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect autumn day that normally would have filled Katherine with appreciation for the beauty of their home. Instead, as they prepared to ride back toward Sweetwater Creek, she found herself observing every detail with heightened awareness, the way sunlight filtered through golden aspen leaves, the crisp scent of pine in the air, the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. It was as though her senses were desperately cataloging the world, unsure if she would experience it the same way again. They rode at a steady pace, taking a circuitous route that would bring them to town from the east opposite, from the direction of their ranch. Vapor had changed from his trail clothes into darker attire that would allow him to move more stealthily when needed. At his hip hung his Colt revolver, and a Winchester rifle was secured in a scabbard on Commander's saddle. Katherine carried Sheriff Dalton's small revolver, hoping fervently that she wouldn't need to use it. Their plan was relatively straightforward. Katherine would enter town openly, seeking out Sheriff Dalton to warn him of Vapor's suspicions about when and how Reese planned to strike. Meanwhile, Vapor would position himself where he could observe the outlaw's movements without being seen. When the moment was right, they would implement the second phase of their strategy, a diversion that would separate the gang members, allowing them to be neutralized individually rather than confronted as a group. As they neared the outskirts of town, Vapor reigned in commander, signaling for Katherine to do the same with Duchess. "Remember," he said, his voice low and urgent, "if anything goes wrong, ride for Fort Laramie, don't look back." Katherine nodded, though they both knew she had no intention of abandoning him or the town. "Be careful," she replied. "Reese may not recognize you immediately, but if he does, he won't get the chance to act on it," Vapor assured her, his expression hardening with resolve. They parted ways at the edge of a small grove of cottonwoods, Vapor melting into the cover of the trees while Katherine continued toward the main road. The town appeared deceptively normal as she approached shopkeepers sweeping their boardwalks, a wagon delivering goods to the general store, children playing in the schoolyard under the supervision of Mrs. Peterson, who had agreed to substitute in Katherine's absence. Yet there was an undercurrent of tension visible in the tight expressions of the adults, the way they hurried their children indoors, the unusual number of men loitering near the bank, with rifles poorly concealed beneath long coats, despite the mild weather. Sheriff Dalton had clearly mobilized his volunteer deputies, but Katherine feared their obvious preparations would only alert Reese to their awareness of his intentions. She rode directly to the sheriff's office, tying Duchess to the hitching post outside. Through the window, she could see Dalton at his desk, deep in conversation with Mr. Fitzgerald from the bank. Both men looked up in surprise as she entered. "Miss Newsom," the sheriff exclaimed, rising quickly. "I thought you were staying at your ranch." "There's been a development," Katherine replied, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Vapor has returned. He knows Jackson Reese from his time as a sheriff in Texas." This revelation caused both men to straighten with increased attention. Katherine quickly relayed what Vapor had shared about Reese's history and tactics, carefully omitting any mention of their current plan. The less people who knew of Vapor's presence in town, the better their chances of surprising the outlaws. "According to Vapor, Reese typically strikes when the target seems most protected," Katherine explained. "He uses the defender's own security measures against them, creating confusion and panic." Sheriff Dalton frowned. "That complicates things." "I've positioned men throughout town, concentrating on the bank." "Which is exactly what he would expect," Katherine pointed out. "Vapor believes Reese has likely already scouted alternate approaches to the bank, possibly through adjacent buildings." Mr. Fitzgerald paled at this suggestion. "The bank shares a wall with the assay office," he admitted. "If someone were to break through, they could bypass most of your defenses," Dalton concluded grimly. "Where is Tanner now? We could use his experience." Katherine hesitated, torn between the need for secrecy and the potential value of having the sheriff fully informed. "He's watching the outlaws," she said finally. "He'll send word when he has more information." The sheriff nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with her answer. "The railroad payment arrived an hour ago," he informed her. "It's already in the safe. We've spread word that it won't arrive until tomorrow, hoping to buy more time, but if Reese has informants in town. Then the robbery could happen today," Katherine finished for him. "I need to reposition my men," Dalton decided. "Fitzgerald, go back to the bank. Act normally, but be prepared to evacuate your staff at a moment's notice." As the banker hurried out, the sheriff turned to Katherine with concern etched in his weathered features. "You should find somewhere safe to wait this out, Miss Newsom. The hotel, perhaps, or the church." "Actually," Katherine replied, steeling herself for the role she needed to play, "I was hoping to collect some books from the schoolhouse. The children will need assignments to complete at home if the school remains closed." Dalton looked like he wanted to object, but after a moment's consideration, he simply nodded. "Be quick about it, and stay away from the saloon. Reese and his men have taken rooms above it, and they've been drinking since midday." Katherine left the sheriff's office with a sense of grim determination. The schoolhouse was indeed her destination, but not for the reason she had given Dalton. It was a key location in the plan she and Vapor had devised, situated directly across from the bank, but set back from the main street, providing excellent sightlines while offering multiple exits if a quick escape became necessary. As she walked through town, Katherine maintained a facade of calm normalcy, nodding politely to those she passed while her eyes constantly scanned for signs of the outlaws or for any glimpse of Vapor. She saw neither, which was both reassuring and unsettling. The schoolhouse was empty when she arrived, Mrs. Peterson having dismissed the children early at Sheriff Dalton's request. Katherine moved to the window that offered the best view of the bank and the saloon across the street. From this vantage point, she could observe much of the main thoroughfare without being obvious about her surveillance. For nearly an hour, she maintained her watch, ostensibly organizing books and papers on her desk whenever anyone passed by the window. The town grew quieter as the afternoon progressed, with most residents heeding the sheriff's subtle encouragement to remain indoors. It was approaching 4 o'clock when Katherine noticed the first sign that their predictions were correct. A wagon loaded with hay pulled up beside the assay office adjacent to the bank. Two men she didn't recognize began unloading the hay with exaggerated effort, making a show of the heavy work while positioning the bales against the building's side wall it shared with the bank. Katherine's pulse quickened. The hay would muffle the sound of breaking through the wall while providing potential cover for the outlaw's escape. It was exactly the kind of clever approach Vapor had suggested Reese might employ. She moved quickly to the back door of the schoolhouse, where she had left a small mirror propped on the windowsill earlier. Angling it to catch the sunlight, she flashed the signal she and Vapor had agreed upon: 3 quick reflections followed by 2 longer ones. From somewhere out of sight, an answering flash confirmed that he had received her message. Phase 2 of their plan was now in motion. Katherine returned to the front of the schoolhouse and picked up the small bell she normally used to summon children from the playground. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, she stepped onto the porch and began ringing it vigorously. "Fire," she called out, her voice carrying across the unnaturally quiet street. Fire at the livery stable, all men needed. It was a calculated risk. The livery stable was at the opposite end of town from the bank, far enough away that the outlaws wouldn't be directly threatened, but close enough that most able-bodied men would respond to the alarm, including, she hoped, some of Sheriff Dalton's deputies positioned near the bank. The effect was immediate. Doors flew open as people emerged to investigate the commotion. Several men, including 2 she recognized as part of the sheriff's volunteer force, immediately ran toward the livery. Others looked confused, glancing between Katherine and the stable, which showed no obvious signs of fire. From the saloon, 4 men emerged onto the boardwalk, their hands hovering near their weapons as they assessed the situation. Katherine recognized Jackson Reese among them, his tall figure commanding even at a distance. He scanned the street with narrowed eyes, clearly suspicious of the convenient distraction. This was the most dangerous moment in their plan. If Reese suspected a trap, he might abandon the robbery attempt or worse, decide to eliminate perceived threats before proceeding. Katherine continued ringing the bell, forcing herself to maintain the appearance of genuine alarm despite the fear coursing through her. Just as she began to worry that Reese had seen through their ruse, a thin tendril of smoke appeared above the livery stable's roof. Vapor had timed his diversion perfectly, starting a small, controlled fire in the hay storage loft enough to create smoke without endangering the building or the horses within. The sight of actual smoke lent credibility to Katherine's alarm. More people rushed toward the stable, including the remaining visible deputies. Reese turned to his companions, issuing orders that Katherine couldn't hear over the growing commotion. Two of the men hurried back into the saloon while Reese and another outlaw crossed the street toward the assay office, moving with deceptive casualness. Katherine set down the bell and slipped back inside the schoolhouse, her heart pounding. Through the window, she watched as Reese and his companion disappeared into the assay office. Moments later, the two men who had been unloading hay also entered, closing the door behind them. This was Vapor's opportunity. With 4 of the 6 gang members now focused on breaking into the bank through the assay office, the remaining 2 would be more vulnerable. Katherine moved to the back of the schoolhouse again, watching for Vapor's signal. It came 3 minutes later, a single flash of light, indicating that he had successfully neutralized one of the outlaws. Katherine allowed herself a moment of relief before returning to her observation post at the front window. The street had emptied again as most townsfolk concentrated on the livery stable situation. Katherine could see Sheriff Dalton directing efforts to extinguish the small fire, unaware that the real danger was unfolding at the opposite end of town. A sudden crash from the direction of the bank drew her attention. Through the bank's front window, she could see signs of chaos, a customer being forced to the floor by a masked man, the teller raising his hands in surrender. Reese had coordinated his attack perfectly, entering through the assay office wall while sending at least one man through the front to control any customers or staff. Katherine knew she needed to alert Sheriff Dalton, but leaving her position might mean missing crucial developments. She was still debating her next move when a hand closed over her mouth from behind. She reacted instinctively, driving her elbow backward into her attacker's midsection. There was a grunt of pain, and the grip loosened enough for her to spin around, reaching for the small revolver in her pocket. "Whoa there, schoolmarm," drawled a voice she didn't recognize. "That's no way to treat a new friend." The man before her was one of Reese's gang, a wiry individual with a pockmarked face and yellowed teeth now revealed in an unpleasant smile. He had a gun trained on her midsection, his finger resting comfortably on the trigger. Reese thought someone might be watching, he continued conversationally. "Sent me to check the buildings with good sightlines to the bank. Lucky me, finding a pretty little spy." Katherine kept her expression neutral despite the fear threatening to overwhelm her. "I'm just preparing lessons," she said, gesturing to the papers on her desk. "The commotion outside distracted me." The outlaw's smile widened. Now, let's not insult each other's intelligence." "You are mighty interested in what's happening at the bank." He motioned with his gun. "Let's go join the festivities, shall we? Reese will want to thank you personally for that clever fire distraction." Katherine knew that if she allowed herself to be taken to Reese, her chances of survival and, by extension, Vapor's chances of successfully intervening would diminish drastically. She needed to stall to create an opportunity. "My students will be returning soon," she tried, taking a small step toward the desk where she had left Sheriff Dalton's revolver. "They were just dismissed temporarily because of the fire alarm." "Lady, you're a terrible liar," the outlaw chuckled. "This whole town's at the other end dealing with our little diversion. Now move before I decide carrying you would be more fun." Katherine's mind raced through her limited options. The outlaw was between her and the front door. The back door was potentially accessible, but she'd never reach it before he could fire. The windows were too small for a quick escape. Her only advantage was her knowledge of the schoolhouse's layout and the fact that Vapor might still be nearby, watching for her signal. Making a split-second decision, Katherine lunged not toward the desk, but toward the large blackboard mounted on the wall beside it. With all her strength, she pulled it away from the wall and sent it crashing toward her attacker. The heavy wooden frame caught the outlaw by surprise, striking him hard enough to disrupt his aim as he fired. The bullet splintered the wood of a nearby desk instead of finding Katherine. She didn't waste the opportunity, diving for the sheriff's revolver and rolling behind the teacher's platform as the outlaw recovered his balance. "You'll pay for that," he snarled, kicking the fallen blackboard aside and advancing toward her position. Katherine rose from behind the platform, the revolver steady in her hands despite her racing heart. "Stop right there," she commanded, her voice firmer than she felt. The outlaw hesitated, reassessing the situation now that his quarry was armed. A calculating look crossed his face. "You won't shoot," he decided after a moment. "Schoolmarms don't have the stomach for it." "I may teach children," Katherine replied evenly, "but I've lived on the frontier long enough to do what's necessary." For a tense moment, they faced each other in silent standoff, the outlaw clearly weighing whether she was bluffing. Then, with a sudden movement, he raised his gun again. Katherine fired first. The revolver's report was deafening in the confined space of the schoolhouse. The outlaw staggered backward, a look of genuine surprise crossing his features as he registered the wound in his shoulder. His own shot went wild, burying itself in the ceiling as he fell against a row of desks. Before he could recover, the back door of the schoolhouse burst open, and Vapor charged in, taking in the scene with a swift glance. In 2 strides, he reached the wounded outlaw and delivered a precise blow to the man's temple with the butt of his Winchester, rendering him unconscious. "Are you hurt?" Vapor asked, his eyes scanning Katherine for any sign of injury. She shook her head, lowering the revolver with hands that had begun to tremble now that the immediate danger had passed. "No, but the robbery is underway. Reese and 3 others are in the bank." Vapor nodded grimly. "Took care of 1 by the saloon. This makes 2. 4 remain." He quickly bound the unconscious outlaw's hands with a length of rope from his pocket, then moved to the window to assess the situation at the bank. "Sheriff?" he asked tersely. "Still at the livery with most of the deputies," Katherine replied, joining him at the window. "We need to get word to him." Vapor considered this for a moment, then made a decision. "I'll draw Reese's attention. When they focus on me, get to Dalton." Katherine wanted to object. The idea of Vapor facing 4 armed men alone was terrifying, but she recognized the logic. With the sheriff and his deputies, they might have enough force to end the situation without further bloodshed. "Be careful," she said, meeting his eyes with an intensity that conveyed everything she couldn't put into words. Vapor held her gaze for a heartbeat, then did something unprecedented. He pulled her close and kissed her, hard and quick, before releasing her and moving toward the door. 5 minutes, he instructed. Then run. Before Katherine could respond, he was gone, slipping out the back door and disappearing around the side of the schoolhouse. She returned to the window, counting the seconds while watching for his next move. She didn't have to wait long. Less than a minute later, a shot rang out from the direction of the assay office, followed by a shout of alarm. Through the bank's window, she could see signs of confusion as attention shifted away from the safe toward the new threat. 2 more shots in quick succession, then a brief silence before a volley of gunfire erupted. Katherine forced herself to remain in position, continuing to count despite her desperate desire to know if Vapor was safe. 4 minutes, just 1 more before she could run for help. A sudden movement caught her eye, one of the outlaws emerging from the bank's front door, gun drawn as he scanned the street. He took cover behind a water trough, firing toward the assay office where Vapor must be positioned. The final minute seemed to stretch endlessly, but when it passed, Katherine steeled herself for action. Checking to ensure the street between the schoolhouse and the direction of the livery stable was clear, she slipped out the front door and ran, keeping to the shadows of buildings whenever possible. The sounds of gunfire continued behind her, spurring her to greater speed despite the constriction of her long skirts. Several townsfolk who had lingered halfway between the bank and the livery looked up in alarm as she passed, but Katherine didn't slow to explain. She found Sheriff Dalton directing the last efforts to extinguish the small fire in the livery loft. The blaze had been contained quickly, causing minimal damage exactly as Vapor had intended. "Sheriff," Katherine called, breathless from her run. "The bank, Reese and his men are robbing it now." Dalton's expression shifted from confusion to understanding to determination in rapid succession. "Harrison, Phillips with me," he ordered 2 nearby deputies. To the gathered townspeople, he shouted, "Armed men to the bank, the rest of you stay back." The response was immediate, with 8 men falling in behind the sheriff as he started toward the bank at a run. Katherine followed, ignoring Dalton's instruction for her to remain behind. She had come this far, she wouldn't wait in safety while Vapor's life hung in the balance. As they approached the center of town, the gunfire grew more sporadic. When they reached the last corner before the bank, Sheriff Dalton held up his hand, signaling for the group to halt while he assessed the situation. "Two men down in the street," he reported after a quick look. "One of Reese's gang for certain, can't identify the other from here." Catherine's heart clenched with fear at his words. Could the unidentified man be Vapor? She pushed the thought aside, unwilling to consider the possibility. "Tanner's in there," she told the sheriff. "He created a diversion to draw attention away from the safe." Dalton nodded grimly. "We'll split up. Harrison, take 3 men around the back through the assay office. Phillips, you and 2 others cover the front entrance. The rest with me will approach from the side alley." As the men dispersed according to the sheriff's directions, Katherine positioned herself where she could observe without being directly in the line of fire. The street had fallen eerily quiet, the earlier gunfire replaced by tense silence. Then, without warning, the bank's front door burst open, and 2 figures emerged. Jackson Reese, instantly recognizable by his height and distinctive black coat, and a hostage he held before him as a shield. Catherine's breath caught as she recognized the hostage as Mr. Fitzgerald, the bank manager. "That's far enough, Sheriff," Reese called out, apparently having spotted Dalton's approach. "We're riding out of here nice and easy or the banker gets ventilated." From her position, Katherine could see the sheriff hesitate, unwilling to risk Fitzgerald's life but equally reluctant to allow the outlaws to escape. The standoff stretched for several tense seconds before another voice joined the confrontation. "Let him go, Jackson." The words, though not shouted, carried clearly in the tense silence. Catherine's heart leaped as Vapor stepped into view from the alley beside the bank, his Winchester trained steadily on Reese. The outlaw leader stiffened at the sound, turning slightly to identify the new threat while maintaining his human shield. Recognition dawned on his face as he took in Vapor's features. "Well, I'll be damned," Reese said, a slow smile spreading across his face despite the precariousness of his position. "Vernon Thomas, or whatever you're calling yourself these days." "It's over," Vapor replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "Your men are down, town surrounded." Reese's smile didn't falter. "Maybe, but I've got the money and a ticket out of here." He pressed his gun harder against Fitzgerald's temple, making the banker whimper. "You won't risk another innocent death, will you, Vernon? Not after your brother." Katherine saw Vapor's expression harden at the mention of Nathan, but his aim remained steady. "Different now," he responded. "Not alone this time." As if to punctuate his words, Sheriff Dalton and his deputies emerged from their positions, forming a loose circle around Reese and his hostage. The outlaw leader's confidence visibly faltered as he assessed the number of weapons trained on him. "You're outnumbered, Reese," Dalton called. "Release Fitzgerald and surrender." For a moment it seemed Reese might comply, his options dwindling with each passing second. Then, with the unpredictability that had made him such a dangerous opponent, he shoved Fitzgerald forward violently and fired rapidly toward Vapor, simultaneously diving toward a nearby horse tethered outside the general store. Everything happened at once. Fitzgerald stumbled and fell to the ground. Deputies fired at Reese, and Vapor moved with lightning reflexes, tackling Katherine, who had unwisely emerged from her sheltered position when she saw Reese's intention out of the line of fire. They landed hard behind a rain barrel, Vapor's body shielding hers as bullets splintered the wood around them. When the fusillade ceased seconds later, an eerie quiet descended once more. "Stay down," Vapor instructed before cautiously raising his head to assess the situation. Katherine held her breath, waiting for his report. When he finally relaxed and offered his hand to help her up, she knew the danger had passed. "Reese?" she asked as they emerged from behind their makeshift shelter. "Dead," Vapor replied simply, indicating where the outlaw leader lay sprawled in the street, multiple bullet wounds evident in his still form. Sheriff Dalton approached them, holstering his revolver. "Everyone all right here?" Katherine nodded, suddenly aware of how close they had come to a very different outcome. "Mr. Fitzgerald, shaken but unharmed," the sheriff assured her. "The bank's secure. 2 of Reese's men surrendered inside when they heard the commotion. Between them and the 2 you managed to subdue earlier, we've got 4 prisoners for the federal marshal when he arrives." Vapor nodded in acknowledgement, his eyes scanning the street with the vigilance of someone not quite convinced the danger had fully passed. Only when he had completed his assessment did he finally holster his own weapon. "Thank you, Tanner," Dalton said, extending his hand. "Town owes you a debt." Vapor accepted the handshake with a slight nod but offered no verbal response. His free hand, Katherine noticed, had found its way to the small of her back, a subtle gesture of reassurance that meant more to her than any words could have. As townsfolk began to emerge from the buildings where they had taken shelter during the confrontation, a sense of cautious relief spread through Sweetwater Creek. The danger had passed. The bank's money was secure. No innocent lives had been lost. Katherine watched as Vapor stepped away to help organize the removal of Reese's body and the secure transport of the prisoners to the jail. Though he spoke little, his actions were clear and decisive, earning respectful nods from the deputies who worked alongside him. It was nearly sunset by the time the immediate aftermath had been addressed. The undertaker had taken charge of Reese's body, the prisoners were securely locked in the jail's cells, and statements had been given to Sheriff Dalton for his report to the territorial authorities. When Vapor finally approached Katherine where she waited on the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office, exhaustion was evident in the lines of his face. Without a word, he offered his arm, which she gladly took. They walked in companionable silence through the town, accepting grateful acknowledgments from those they passed, but not stopping to engage in lengthy conversations. It wasn't until they reached the edge of town, where they had left their horses tied in a small grove of trees, that Vapor finally spoke. "Ready to go home?" he asked, his voice rough with fatigue but carrying an undertone of something Katherine hadn't heard before, peace, perhaps, or resolution. "More than ready," she replied, smiling up at him as he helped her mount Duchess. The ride back to their ranch was quiet, both of them processing the events of the day and finding comfort in the familiar landscape that surrounded them. The sun had fully set by the time they arrived, the house a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky. As they tended to the horses and made their way inside, Katherine felt the tension of the day finally begin to release its hold. She lit the lamps while Vapor built a fire in the hearth, the simple domestic actions grounding them both after the chaos they had survived. When Vapor finally settled into his chair by the fire, Katherine brought him a cup of coffee and took the seat opposite him. For several minutes, they simply existed in the shared space, the crackling fire and the occasional call of a night bird the only sounds. "Jackson Reese can't hurt anyone else now," Katherine said softly, breaking the silence. "It's over." Vapor nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. 8 years, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Chased his ghost across 3 territories. Never thought it would end here. Does it feel like justice?" She asked, genuinely curious about how this resolution affected the man who had carried the burden of his brother's death for so long. Vapor considered the question with his characteristic thoroughness. "Not justice," he finally decided. "Just ending. Nathan's still gone, but the debt's settled." Katherine understood the distinction he was making. There could be no true justice for Nathan's murder, nothing could bring him back or erase the pain of his loss. But the man responsible had finally faced consequences, allowing Vapor to lay down the weight of vengeance he had carried for so long. "What now?" she asked, the question encompassing far more than their immediate future. Vapor's gaze shifted from the fire to her face, studying her with an intensity that made her heart quicken. "Never had a what now before," he admitted. "Always just the next day, the next trail, and now." Katherine prompted gently. He set his coffee cup aside and leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees as he gathered his thoughts. When he spoke again, it was with careful deliberation, each word chosen with precision. "Thinking maybe words matter more than I allowed," he said. "Some things." Need saying, Catherine waited, giving him the space to continue at his own pace. After a moment, he reached across the distance between them and took her hand in his. Love you, Catherine, he said simply. Have from the first day will till the last. Though she had known his feelings through his actions, his protection, his presence, his steady support, hearing the declaration aloud brought tears to her eyes. In typical Vapor fashion, he had distilled complex emotion into its purest essence, offering not flowery sentiment but honest truth. I love you too, she replied, her voice steady despite her tears. Every day, through every silence. Vapor rose from his chair and drew her to her feet, pulling her into an embrace that conveyed more than words ever could. They stood together before the fire, the barriers that had separated them his reticence. Her uncertainty finally dissolved in the aftermath of danger, faced and overcome together. Later that night, as they lay in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Vapor spoke again, his voice a low rumble against Catherine's hair. Thought about it, he said. While riding the range, while watching for your signal at the gate each time, thought about asking properly. Catherine propped herself up on one elbow, trying to see his expression in the moonlight filtering through the window. Asking what? In answer, Vapor reached to the small table beside the bed and retrieved something from his saddlebag. When he opened his hand, a simple gold band gleamed in the dim light. Bought it in Cheyenne, he explained. Before seeing Reese on the trail, was coming home to ask. Catherine's breath caught as she understood what he was offering. Are you asking now? She whispered. Vapor nodded, his expression solemn yet tender. Katherine Newsom, marry me properly, I mean. Though they had lived as husband and wife in all but name for the past 3 years, an arrangement not uncommon in frontier communities where preachers and judges were scarce, they had never formalized their union. Catherine had never pressed the issue, understanding Vapor's reluctance to engage with social institutions after his disillusionment with the justice system. Yes, she answered without hesitation, nothing would make me happier. The ring slid perfectly onto her finger as though it had been waiting for this moment. Vapor's smile, rare and precious, illuminated his features in the darkness. Think I might have more to say, he mused, his tone lighter than she had ever heard it. Now that Reese's ghost isn't riding with me. Catherine laughed softly, joy bubbling up inside her. I've always heard what matters most, she assured him, but I wouldn't mind a few more words now and then. 2 weeks later, on a crisp autumn morning, Catherine stood beside Vapor in Sweetwater Creek's small church, exchanging vows before Reverend Miller and nearly the entire population of the town. The story of their confrontation with Reese and his gang had spread quickly, transforming them from respected but somewhat mysterious residents into local heroes. Vapor, to everyone's surprise, including Catherine's, had spoken his vows in a clear, unwavering voice that carried to the back of the church. Though still a man of few words, those he chose to share had taken on new significance, each one a deliberate gift rather than a reluctant necessity. As they walked back down the aisle as officially husband and wife, Sheriff Dalton stepped forward to shake Vapor's hand. Thought you might want to know, he said quietly. Got word from the federal marshal. With the statements from Reese's captured men, they've cleared your name in Texas. The old warrants for Vernon Thomas have been withdrawn. Vapor nodded in acknowledgement, the last shadow of his past finally lifted. Appreciate that, Sheriff, but I'm Vapor Tanner now, have been for some time. Catherine squeezed his arm gently, understanding the significance of his declaration. He was no longer running from his past or hiding behind a new identity. He had truly become the man he had chosen to be, outside the church. Well-wishers surrounded them with congratulations and good wishes. Catherine noticed with amusement that several of the town's more talkative residents seemed unsure how to interact with Vapor, their usual stream of conversation faltering in the face of his characteristic brevity. Yet there was a difference now. Where once his silence had created distance, it now seemed to draw people closer, each careful word valued like currency. And occasionally, to the delight of those around him, he would offer a complete thought or even a dry observation that revealed the intelligence and wit that had always existed beneath his taciturn exterior. As the celebration continued at the town hall, with food and music and dancing that would likely last well into the evening, Vapor drew Katherine aside for a moment of relative privacy. "Happy?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. Katherine smiled, the simple question encompassing everything that mattered. "Completely," she assured him. "And you?" Vapor glanced around at the community that had become their home, then back to the woman who had waited faithfully at their gate, believing in his return when others might have given up hope. His answer, when it came, held all the eloquence she could ever desire. "Found my voice," he said, drawing her close. "Found my peace, found you, everything I need." As they rejoined the celebration, Katherine reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The silent cowboy who rode the range without speaking had found his way home, not just to a place but to a person who understood that some of life's deepest truths existed in the spaces between words. And the woman who had waited at the gate had discovered that patience wasn't merely endurance, but a form of faith in a love strong enough to survive separation, danger, and the long silences of a man learning to trust again. Together, they had written a story that needed no elaborate declarations to be understood, a story etched in the steadfast rhythm of waiting and returning, in the quiet courage of standing together when danger threatened, and in the simple, profound joy of building a life where words, when they came, were treasured all the more for their rarity. In the years that followed, Vapor never became what anyone would consider talkative. But in the privacy of their home, with Katherine, and eventually with the children who joined their family, a daughter with her mother's expressive eyes, and a son with his father's contemplative nature, he found a balance between his natural inclination toward silence and his growing appreciation for the power of well-chosen words. And Katherine, who had once filled silences out of nervousness or uncertainty, discovered the eloquence of quiet moments shared with a man who spoke most clearly through his actions, his protection, and his unwavering presence. Each evening, as the sun set over the Wyoming plains they both loved, Vapor would return from tending the ranch that had prospered under his careful management. And each evening, Katherine would stand at the gate, watching for his approach not from fear or doubt, but from the simple pleasure of seeing the man she loved returning to the home they had built together. It became their ritual, as familiar and necessary as breathing the cowboy who rode the range, finding his way back to the woman who waited at the gate, their story written not in grand declarations but in the steady rhythm of days shared, and a love that had never needed many words to be understood.